finish what I started?" The words came out of him like a blade leaving a sheath, slow, quiet, and already cutting before I'd registered the damage. Baek-hyeon stood in the center of my Manhattan apartment at 2 in the morning. No jacket. White dress shirt half open, the tattoos on his chest disappearing into his collar like the edge of a map I'd never been given permission to read. His dark eyes hadn't moved from my face since I'd said it. Since I'd actually looked at a man who made entire organizations disappear overnight and told him to his face that he had unfinished business in my bed. The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then he said, "You think you can talk to me like that, Dr. Kyle?" I crossed my arms. I just did. Welcome to the Afro-Korean show, dear friends. Before this story takes you somewhere you can't come back from, hit that subscribe button right now. This channel is brand new and every single subscriber tells the algorithm we exist. Like this video, share it with your girls, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Let's build this community together. Now, let's get into it. Let me tell you how I ended up here. Not in the apartment. I've had this place on the Upper West Side since I finished my residency at New York Presbyterian. For years of 60-hour weeks and surgical precision, and being the only Black woman in every room that mattered until I wasn't. I earned this apartment. I earned everything in it. What I didn't earn was Baek-hyeon Choi. And I need to be honest with you about something before I tell you the rest of the story, because none of it makes sense if I'm not. I need to tell you that from the very beginning, from the first moment I stepped into that operating room, I had a plan. And I need to tell you that his plan was better. My brother Marcus is 24 years old and beautiful and careless in the way that only men who've never truly suffered can be. He grew up the same way I did, south side of Atlanta, mama working doubles, dad gone before Marcus was old enough to miss him. But where I turned all that into fuel, Marcus turned it into risk. Into shortcuts. Into the kind of confidence that looks like ambition until it doesn't. 6 months ago, Marcus got involved in a crypto deal with a man named Ji-won Park. Ji-won moved money for Choi Baek-hyeon, the most feared name in Korean organized crime operating on American soil. The deal collapsed. The money disappeared. And Marcus, in his infinite 24-year-old wisdom, had signed his name to every piece of it. $2 million. 30 days. When Marcus called me from a burner phone at midnight crying, I didn't yell at him. I didn't ask questions I didn't need the answers to. I sat in the dark of my apartment and I thought like a surgeon. Which means I thought about what I could reach, what I could control, and what I was willing to cut to save the patient. I had 3 weeks before the deadline. I started researching Baek-hyeon Choi. Not online. There's almost nothing online, which is its own kind of terrifying. What I found came from a source inside the NYPD's Organized Crime Division who owed me a favor after I saved his partner on my table last November. Partial files. Redacted surveillance notes. Enough. Baek-hyeon controlled the Eastern Seaboard's most sophisticated money laundering network, built through legitimate corporations in finance, real estate, and healthcare consulting. He was 36 years old. He had not one identified weakness. Except one. Ji-won Park. Ji-won was his right-hand, childhood friend, closest confidant, the only person on Earth Baek-hyeon was documented to have shown any measurable concern for. And according to the partial hospital records I wasn't supposed to have accessed, Ji-won had an undiagnosed aortic aneurysm that had been growing quietly for 2 years. The kind that would eventually demand emergency surgery. The kind that, if it happened in New York City, would come through one of 3 hospitals. One of which was mine. I'm a cardiothoracic surgeon, besties. Top of my field, 30 years old, hands that haven't shaken since my first year of residency. If Ji-won Park's aneurysm ruptured in New York City, there was a reasonable probability he ended up on my table. I just needed to make that probability a certainty. It took me 48 hours and 3 favors I'd been saving for years to arrange it. I traded shifts, pulled strings, got myself permanently assigned to the cardiovascular trauma rotation that covered Ji-won's neighborhood. I told myself it was strategy. I told myself a surgeon calculates every angle. I did not let myself think about what it meant to engineer proximity to a man like Baek-hyeon Choi. 3 days later, at 11:17 on a Tuesday night, Ji-won Park's aneurysm ruptured at a restaurant in Midtown Manhattan, and the ambulance brought him to New York Presbyterian. I was already scrubbed in. The surgery took 6 hours and 14 minutes. I don't remember all of it in order, I never do, not the hard ones. I remember the moment I saw the rupture and my resident actually gasped, and I said stop in a voice that silenced the room. I remember my hands moving with something past training, past technique, something that feels, in the middle of it, almost like prayer. I remember the moment his heart stabilized and everyone in that room exhaled at the same time, and I just stood there with blood on my gloves and thought, okay. I remember walking out of the OR at 5:43 in the morning. And I remember seeing him. Baek-hyeon Choi was standing in the hallway outside the surgical suite like he owned the hospital. He probably did, in some arrangement I wasn't aware of. He was wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than my monthly mortgage, and he was flanked by 2 men who had the stillness of people trained to be invisible until they weren't. But I barely registered any of that. I registered him. He was, and I say this as a woman who has met powerful men in every professional context imaginable, he was the most visually arresting person I had ever been in the same room with. Not handsome in a soft way. Handsome in the way a blade is, precise, clean, and built entirely to cut. He was tall, and the ink on the back of his hands disappeared under his cuffs in dark, deliberate lines. His face gave nothing away. Nothing at all. He looked at me like I was information he was cataloging. Dr. Kyle. His voice was low and accented, and gave me absolutely nothing to work with emotionally. Ji-won's status. I pulled off my surgical cap. I was exhausted. I was running on 3 hours of sleep and 6 hours of adrenaline, and I had a plan, and standing here in front of this man, the plan suddenly felt very small. He's stable, I said. The surgery went well. He'll need 4 to 6 weeks of monitored recovery, no exertion, controlled environment. We almost lost him twice in the first hour. I paused. We didn't. Something moved through Baek-hyeon's expression. So fast I almost missed it. Almost. What do you need? He said. Excuse me. For his recovery. What do you need that this hospital can't provide? I looked at him for a moment. Are you asking if you can buy his way to a better outcome? I'm asking what you need. His tone didn't shift even slightly. Name it. Your man needs rest and monitoring and 0 stress for 6 weeks, I said. That's not something money fixes. That's something compliance fixes. Make sure he follows the discharge protocol and he'll be fine. He looked at me for another 3 seconds. Then he said, you'll oversee his recovery personally. It wasn't a question. Mr. Choi. You'll oversee his recovery personally, he repeated, and you'll be compensated above your hospital rate. This is not negotiable. I should have said no. I said, I'll need full access to his vitals remotely. He nodded once. You'll have it. That was how it started. That was how I stepped into his world with a plan and a scalpel and the absolute certainty that I knew what I was doing. Ji-won recovered at a private medical facility in Tribeca, not a hospital, a facility, the kind that exists only for people whose privacy is its own kind of security measure. I visited 4 times a week. Every time I did, Baek-hyeon was there. Not hovering, not intrusive, just present. The way a shadow is present. The first week, we barely spoke beyond Ji-won's care. The second week, Baek-hyeon started asking questions. Not about me specifically, about the surgery, about what I'd seen, about the technical decisions I'd made in the moments where Ji-won's life had hung on what I chose to cut and what I chose to leave. He asked with the precision of someone who understood systems and margins and calculated risk. He listened the way people do when they actually process information instead of just waiting to respond. I found myself answering more than I planned to. The third week, Ji-won, who was sharp and warm and nothing like I'd expected, looked between the two of us during a checkup and said in Korean something that made Baek-hyeon go very still. He says you have the same face, Baek-hyeon translated flatly, when you're deciding something. What face? Certain. Already 3 steps ahead of the room. I looked at Ji-won. He was grinning. I told myself that was the moment I should have ended this and found another way to save Marcus. I didn't end it. The dinner happened on a Thursday. Baek-hyeon invited me, If you could call it an invitation, which I couldn't, really, because it arrived as a car outside my hospital at 8 p.m. and a message that simply said dinner, 11 Madison Park, car is waiting. And I stood on the sidewalk in my work clothes and my edges half done from a 12-hour shift, and I thought about saying no. I got in the car. I told myself it was the plan. I told myself I was getting closer to the moment I could bring up Marcus. I told myself a lot of things in that car, besties, and I believed exactly none of them. Dinner was not what I expected. He didn't perform. He didn't charm. He sat across from me in a restaurant that felt like a cathedral, and he spoke to me like I was the only other person in the world who understood what it was to carry things alone. He didn't tell me about the Mafia. He talked about G1, how they'd grown up together in a part of Seoul where survival was a group project, how he'd built everything he had with G1 beside him, how he hadn't slept in 4 days after the rupture because for the first time in 20 years, he'd seen a future he couldn't control. You saved him, he said. His eyes were on his glass. I don't say that carelessly. I know, I said. He looked up. How do you know? Because you don't do anything carelessly. The silence that followed felt like a test I was passing without knowing the rubric. He poured more wine and said, "Tell me about Atlanta." And I did. I don't know why. I told him about my mother's hands, rough from years of work, and the way she used to smooth my hair before school like she was preparing me for battle. I told him about the first time I walked into an operating room as a student and felt, for the first time in my life, like the room had been built for me. I told him about the particular loneliness of being excellent in a field that keeps looking past you for someone who looks different. He listened to all of it without once looking away. When the car brought me home, he walked me to my building door. He didn't touch me. He stood close enough that I could see the faint scar along his jawline, the one I'd noticed before and never asked about. Same time next week, he said. Not a question. You keep doing that, I said. Doing what? Deciding things for me. He looked at me with something in his eyes that I couldn't name. You've been deciding things for yourself your whole life, Dr. Kyle. You look like you could use one night off from it. He left before I could answer. I stood outside my building at midnight in the New York cold and I thought, this is getting complicated. The third dinner never happened. What happened instead was a phone call at midnight 2 days later, G1's vitals spiking, a post-surgical complication, not life-threatening but serious, and I needed to go to the facility immediately. Baek-hyeon's car was at my building in 9 minutes. I don't know how. I didn't ask. We sat in the back of that car in the dark, and I was in sweats with no makeup and my natural hair pulled back, and he looked at me like I was exactly right. G1 stabilized within the hour. I stayed until 4 a.m. adjusting his medication, monitoring. When I finally walked out of his room, Baek-hyeon was in the hallway with 2 cups of coffee from somewhere that shouldn't have been open at 3:30 in the morning. He handed me one. I took it. We stood there in that quiet hallway drinking coffee, and I looked at his profile in the dim light, the hard line of his jaw, the tattoos that curved along the side of his neck, the way he held himself like stillness was a discipline. And something in my chest moved that I had not given permission to move. Why don't you sleep? I asked. He turned to look at me. Why aren't you afraid of me? I didn't say I wasn't. You're not. I held his gaze. I grew up afraid of real things. Rent, hunger, the ER bill when my mama got sick. You're dangerous, Baek-hyeon, but you've never been a threat to me. You know the difference. He was quiet for a long time. Then, you're the first person who's ever explained that to me. I went home at 5 a.m. knowing I was in trouble. I kissed him first. I want to be clear about that because later, in the wreckage, it mattered to me that I owned it. We were at my apartment. He'd come to review G1's discharge plan, which we both knew was a reason and not the reason. I'd cooked jollof rice, my mother's recipe, the one I make when I need to feel like myself, and he'd sat at my kitchen counter and watched me cook with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. Something unguarded. Something almost soft. After dinner, he stood to leave. And I said his name. When he turned, I crossed the distance between us, put my hand on his chest right over the ink, and I kissed him. He went still for exactly 1 second, One single breath, and then his hands were at my waist, and he kissed me back with the particular intensity of a man who had been deciding not to for a very long time. The rest of that night was ours. And in the morning, he was gone. Not fled, his jacket was folded on the chair, which was somehow worse. A text that said, "Hospital meeting, tonight 7. Professional. Clean." Like the night before was a file he'd closed and shelved. I stared at that text for a long time. Then I called Marcus. My brother answered on the second ring. I hadn't told him my plan. I'd kept him completely in the dark because Marcus panics, and when Marcus panics he talks, and I couldn't have him talking. But 3 weeks had passed, and I was no closer to finding the right moment to bring up his debt, and something about the morning, about being left in my own bed by a man who looked at me like I was precious and then vanished, cracked something open in me. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked immediately. "I need to know," I said. "The deadline. Did anything change?" A pause. A strange pause. "Tessa." "Marcus. 3 weeks ago. Someone contacted my point of contact and said the debt was cleared." His voice was careful. "I didn't tell you because I thought you'd done something and I was scared to ask what." I sat down on the edge of my bed. 3 weeks ago was the night I saved Ji-won. The night I walked out of the OR and Baek-hyeon was standing in that hallway. I went to the 7 o'clock meeting. It was at a building in Midtown that housed a legitimate investment firm on 12 floors, and I now understood everything else underneath. Baek-hyeon sat across a boardroom table from me with 2 of his men in the room, and he walked me through Ji-won's long-term care plan with the same precision he brought to everything. And I sat there with Marcus's words ringing in my ears and looked at the man across from me like I was seeing him for the first time. He'd cleared the debt before I'd had a chance to ask. Before he'd known me. Before the dinners, before my kitchen, before last night. He'd done it the same night Ji-won survived. I'd saved someone he loved, and his response, his immediate, unilateral response, was to remove the threat from someone I loved. Someone he didn't even know I had. Which meant he'd had me investigated. Which meant he'd known about Marcus this whole time. Which meant he'd known about the plan. The meeting ended. His men left the room. The silence was enormous. "How long?" I asked. He didn't pretend not to know what I meant. "Your file crossed my desk the morning after the surgery. You knew." My voice was steady. "Surgical. You knew why I arranged to be in that, or?" "I knew you arranged it, yes." He was looking at me directly. "I didn't know why until the file came through." "And you let me?" I stopped. I reorganized. "You sat across from me for 3 weeks knowing I had an agenda, and you said nothing." "I cleared your brother's debt the first night," he said. "Before I read the file. Ji-won was alive, and I was grateful, and that was the decision I made." He paused. "The file came after. The agenda came after. So you investigated me." "I investigate everyone in my proximity. It's not personal. But you let me keep." The word I wanted was performing, but it wasn't quite right, and we both knew it. "You let me keep showing up." "Knowing." "Yes." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that meant he was choosing carefully. "Because within the first 30 seconds of meeting you," he said, "I could tell that whatever reason brought you to that, or what you did inside it was real. No one performs like that. No one fights like that for a stranger." His eyes didn't move from mine. And I wanted to know the person who did. I stood up. I gathered my bag. I walked to the door. And then I turned around, and I looked at him sitting at that table, tattooed and dangerous, and looking at me with something he didn't know how to name, and I said it. "You kissed me back last night like it meant something. You held me like it was the first real thing that's happened to you in years. And then you disappeared this morning like it was a transaction." My voice didn't shake. "So, let me be clear with you, Baek-hyeon. Finish what you started. Or, don't come to my bed again." The room went absolutely silent. He stared at me. No one, I would learn later, from Ji-won, who heard it from security footage, no one had ever spoken to Baek-hyeon Choi like that. Not his lieutenants, not rival bosses, not anyone in his 20 years of absolute authority over everyone in his world. He didn't move for a very long time. Then he stood up. "You think you know what you're asking for," he said. He came around the table slowly, the way dangerous things move, no rush, no noise, total certainty of arrival. "I'm a surgeon," I said. I don't ask for things I haven't thought all the way through. He stopped in front of me, close enough that I could see the scar on his jaw again, the one I'd never asked about. If I finish what I started, he said quietly, I don't stop. You understand that? Not when it's inconvenient. Not when it's complicated. Not when my world touches yours in ways that should make you run. His voice was low and completely serious. I don't do halfway. I never have. Neither do I. Your brother is free. Your debt to me is nothing. You can walk out of here and go back to your life and never see me again and you'd be safe. Better than safe. I know. So why are you still standing here? I looked at him, really looked at him. At the man underneath the empire, the one who'd sat at my kitchen counter watching me cook like it was the most peaceful thing he'd seen in years. At the man who'd cleared my brother's debt without being asked, before he'd known me, because someone he loved was alive and generosity was his first instinct even when his reputation said otherwise. Because you held me last night, I said, like you were afraid to let go. And I think that's probably the truest thing you've done in a long time. The silence this time was different. His hand came up slowly, deliberately, and cupped my face. I had you investigated, he said, and every piece of information I found made me trust you more. Not less. That has never happened before in my life. His thumb moved across my cheekbone. I disappeared this morning because I didn't know what to do with that. Yeah, I said softly. Me neither. I'm not an easy man. I'm not an easy woman. Something shifted in his eyes. Something warm underneath all that controlled danger. No, he said. You're not. What came next wasn't a fairy tale. I want to be honest about that. There was a week, about a month later, where a rival network, the CO family, who'd been watching Baek-hyeon's territory for years, made a move. They'd identified me as a point of access. Not through anything I'd done deliberately. Through my colleague Dr. Priya Shah, who'd been feeding information about my schedule, my movements, my relationship with Baek-hyeon, to someone she owed a favor she'd never told me about. I didn't know. Baek-hyeon did. He'd known for 2 weeks before it became critical. He hadn't told me because he was handling it, that was his word, handling, and he thought keeping me clear of it was the same as protecting me. It was the first real fight we had. Not about the danger, about the decision. About him deciding, again, what I could and couldn't handle. You keep moving pieces on a board I'm standing on, I said, and not telling me the board exists. I was protecting. I am a grown black woman from Atlanta who put herself through medical school, passed her boards on the first attempt, and saved your best friend's life on 6 hours of sleep, I said. Do not protect me from information. Protect me from threats. There's a difference. He looked at me for a long time. Then, you're right. 2 words. Clean. No qualification. I stared at him. Did you just? Don't make it strange. Ji-won, who was sitting on my couch drinking tea and absolutely not supposed to be witnessing this conversation, laughed so hard he spilled it. The CO situation was resolved in ways I only know partial details of, and I've made peace with that partition. What I know is that by mid-February I was no longer being followed. Priya had resigned from the hospital and relocated with her family, and Baek-hyeon had restructured something significant in his operation that Ji-won said, with enormous understatement, closed several doors. What I also know is that on the night it was over, Baek-hyeon came to my apartment at midnight with no warning, and he sat on my kitchen floor, not the couch, the floor, back against the cabinet, and I sat beside him. And for a long time neither of us said anything. Then he said, I'm tired. Not complaining. Just telling me. The way you tell someone the truth when the armor is finally too heavy. I know, I said. I don't know how to be careful with something I want to keep. I looked at him. You're learning. Slowly. I'm patient. I leaned my head against his shoulder. I'm a surgeon. We do long procedures. He exhaled. And for the first time since I'd known him, I felt the tension leave his body completely. Marcus came to New York in March. I hadn't planned for them to meet. I was still operating on separate world instincts, but Baek-hyeon showed up while Marcus was at my apartment, and the 3 of us ended up eating takeout on my living room floor like it was the most normal thing in the world. Marcus, who has no survival instincts whatsoever, looked at Baek-hyeon's hands, the tattoos, the rings, the very particular stillness, and said, So you're the guy. Baek-hyeon looked at him. Yes. You cleared my debt. I did. Marcus nodded slowly. Why? Baek-hyeon glanced at me. Then back at Marcus. Your sister saved someone I can't afford to lose. I don't let debts go unbalanced. Marcus looked at me. He has my mother's eyes and he was using them at full power. Is he always like this? Yes, I said. And you like it? Marcus. I'm just asking. Marcus. Baek-hyeon, for the first time in front of my brother, almost smiled. Almost. In April, Ji-won was fully cleared by a cardiologist whose opinion I'd solicited from Johns Hopkins just to have the independent confirmation. We had a small dinner to celebrate, just the four of us, Baek-hyeon, Ji-won, me, and Ji-won's girlfriend Sarah, at a restaurant in the West Village where no one knew who anyone was, and it was just people at a table eating good food. Ji-won gave a toast in Korean. Baek-hyeon translated it for me quietly, his mouth near my ear. He says the only person in this room who has ever truly frightened Baek-hyeon is sitting to his left. I turned to look at him. That's terrifying. To me it was, he said. Yes. Why? His eyes were on mine. Because you walked into my world with a plan and no weapons and more courage than anyone I've ever met, and you made me want to be worth it. My throat tightened. Were you? I managed. Worth it. He picked up my hand from the table. He held it the way he holds everything, completely, deliberately, with the understanding that he's decided and doesn't revisit decisions. Ask me in 20 years, he said. Let me tell you what nobody tells you about loving a man like Baek-hyeon Choi. They tell you about the danger, and yes, there are nights I lie awake understanding the particular texture of the world he lives in. There are things I know and things I've agreed not to know, and I've made my peace with that border. I'm a surgeon. I understand that some wounds you treat and some you manage and some you simply monitor and trust the body to handle. What nobody tells you is the other side of it. The way a man like that, a man who has spent 20 years in a world where showing care is showing weakness, shows care when he lets himself. It's not grand gestures. It's remembering that I prefer silence in the mornings. It's a car at the hospital every time I'm on a late shift, without being asked, without announcement. It's the way he learned to say, "You're right," the night I demanded it of him, and how that two-word sentence, in his mouth, cost him something real, and he gave it anyway. It's the night I came home from a surgery I'd lost, the ones that break you, the ones every surgeon carries forever, and he didn't tell me it wasn't my fault, because he understood that wasn't what I needed. He just sat with me in the dark until I was ready to be somewhere else. He told me once, months later, that I'd been the first thing in 20 years that had made him want to be found. I told him he'd been the first thing that made me want to stop running toward the next achievement long enough to figure out what I actually wanted. He said, and I said, apparently I want this. This. The corner of his mouth. Specific. I want you, I said. Specifically. Completely. Even the parts you're still working on. He kissed me with the kind of certainty that has no performance in it at all. We got married in September. Not a big wedding, neither of us wanted that. A small ceremony in a private space in Manhattan with Ji-won and Sarah and Marcus and my best friend Dana, who cried through the entire thing and kept elbowing me like she couldn't believe this was my life. She couldn't. Honestly, some days neither could I. Baek-hyeon in a suit. Baek-hyeon saying words he'd clearly wrestled with and chosen carefully, the way he does everything, in a quiet voice that was just for me. I said mine back and watched something shift in his face, something that looked like relief. Like a man who had lived his whole life braced for impact and had finally, been given permission to set his arms down. Marcus walked me in. My mother, who flew up from Atlanta and who took one look at Baek-hyeon and then at me and said nothing for a full minute before she took his face in her hands the way she used to take mine and said, "Take care of my daughter," and Baek-hyeon said, "Yes, ma'am," with more reverence than I'd ever heard from him in any context. I will love him forever just for that. People ask me sometimes, colleagues, friends, once a reporter who somehow got 2 minutes near me at a conference, how I ended up here. How a black girl from Atlanta who became a Manhattan cardiothoracic surgeon ended up married to that. Usually they can't even finish the sentence. I tell them the truth. I walked into his world with a plan. I thought I was the one moving pieces on the board. Turns out he'd read the board before I sat down, and he'd decided before he knew my name, before he'd heard me speak, in the 6 hours I was inside and or fighting for someone he loved, that whatever brought me to that table, I was worth meeting. He cleared my brother's debt before he knew my face. He let me run my plan knowing it was a plan because the plan itself told him something true about who I was. And he stood in my boardroom while I looked him in the eye and told him to finish what he started, and instead of doing what men like him do, he chose me. Not because I was soft. Because I wasn't. Not because I needed him. Because I didn't. Because I stood in his world without shrinking, and I looked at the most dangerous man in the room and I told him the truth, and the truth was, you matter to me, and I am not going to let you run from it. He hadn't been spoken to like that. Not once in 36 years. I think that's what love is sometimes. Someone who sees you clearly enough to demand you show up. Besties. If this story did something to you, if you felt that, then you already know what to do. Hit that like button right now. Not later. Now. It takes 1 second and it tells YouTube this story deserves to be seen. Subscribe to this channel. We are brand new and we are just getting started, and I promise you, the stories coming next will ruin you in the best way. You do not want to miss what's coming. 1 click. That's all. Share this video with at least one person tonight. Your best friend, your sister, your group chat. Someone needs this story in their life, and you know exactly who. And drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me which moment broke you. Was it when she said, finish what you started? Was it his face at the altar? Was it what he did for Marcus before he even knew her name? Tell me. I read every single one. This channel grows because of you. You are the reason we make these. So thank you for being here from the very beginning. That means everything. We'll see you in the next one, friends. And trust me, the next one is coming for your whole heart.